Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit that protects land in Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976 and have protected over 60,000 acres in our county so far. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members and contributors. So thanks to all of you out there for helping us protect beautiful Sonoma County for future generations. As we pursue our mission of conserving land in Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous people. We honor their knowledge, care, and stewardship of this special place across the ages and acknowledge the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted on them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and protect their culture and traditional connections to the land. Dr. Yamina Pressler is an associate professor of soil science and restoration ecology at Cal Poly St. Luis Obispo, where she leads the Coastal Soil Horizon and Ecological Lab. Her research focuses on soil ecology formation and plant-soil linkages to inform ecosystem restoration and stewardship. Her research team studies soil biota and organic material in the context of rangeland restoration, fire management, and climate-smart agriculture in the coastal California bioregion. Yamina is also an educator and science communicator committed to collective soils conservation and care. She received a PhD in ecology from Colorado State University and a BS in environmental management from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Yamina Pressler.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the introduction, Gregory, and also for the invitation to speak tonight. Give me just a moment to share my screen here. As we begin, I also would like to thank Mariana for providing translation for our talk tonight. I really appreciate that. And I am so excited to share my love with soils and grasslands with you all here. So if you're here tonight, thanks for coming. If you're watching this later, I so appreciate you spending the time to think a little bit about soils with me today. And so I'm going to share a bit more about our work in studying soils in coastal grasslands around California. And along the way, I hope to inspire you to think a little bit differently about soils and see them as a natural wonder and so much more than just a medium for plant growth. And so before I started thinking about soils as a scientist, I kind of had this view that soils look something like this. They're just this medium for plant growth. And actually, if you do a Google search of soil, you probably come up with a photo that looks something like this. But now, after spending time studying soils in nature, I have come to learn that soils are more like this. They are colorful and complex and dynamic, and they vary so much across space and time. And so while I used to think of soils as this homogeneous thing out there in nature that supported plant growth, I now appreciate them for so much more than that. And I hope today that you are able to gain a little bit of that appreciation too. I want to start with some definitions. So, thinking about what soil actually is. And in addition to supporting life on the surface of the earth, soil is an integrative part of the earth system. So, it sits at the nexus of plants and organisms and wildlife up above, integrates with the atmosphere, and also links to the hydrosphere and water, and then rocks and geology below. And so soil is really at this special part in the Earth system where it connects with everything else. And because of that, soils are incredibly diverse and variable, and they're also really important for many of the ecosystem services that the environment provides to humanity. Some of those ecosystem services include things that you might be familiar with, like provisioning our food. Soils are, of course, the foundation of agriculture. Soils are also important for providing habitat for biodiversity and regulating our water resources. Soils have a really big role to play in regulating our climate and storing carbon within the biosphere. And there are even examples of organisms living within the soil providing pharmaceutical and genetic resources that support our healthcare. And so soils are inextricably linked with humans, what we do, what we need to survive and thrive on this planet. And I want to highlight a couple of examples that really demonstrate this. So soils support plant diversity around the world. This is a beautiful picture from the desert. I just could absolutely not resist showing you a photo of the desert in bloom. Of course, if it weren't for soils, then we wouldn't be able to experience these natural wonders of plant biodiversity in many of the places that we recreate, we live, and we enjoy on the day to day. And it's not just plants. Soils also create habitat for wildlife like snakes and ground squirrels and these cute burrowing owls that I photographed out in the Salton Sea. Soils are full of life. And that's one thing that makes soils different than rocks. They support life, they support this biological activity that is so important and unique part of the Earth system. And so while you might be familiar with some of these larger organisms that live within the soil, it turns out that there's also a perplexingly diverse group of microorganisms and soil fauna that live below ground. This is an image that I think highlights this diversity of soil organisms that is really well, where lots of different organisms are shown in each of these images here. Some of those organisms you might be familiar with, like an earthworm, and or perhaps the tardigrade, which is by far the internet's favorite soil organism. And some you may be less familiar with, like nematodes or maybe some microarthropods. And what I want to highlight here is that there are many different types of organisms that live within the soil, and they range from very tiny single-celled bacteria all the way up to earthworms and even the burrowing owl, like I showed you earlier. So you might imagine that these organisms living within the soil are interacting in many unique ways across wide spatial and temporal scales that give rise to the diversity of those different ecosystem functions that I mentioned earlier, and also the unique soil types that we see around the world. And so I'm really interested in conserving soils, and I know that I'm not the only one. Soils provide so many important things to humanity, but they're also a natural wonder. They're part of the environment that deserves to be celebrated and is so often overlooked. Because soils are everywhere, it's easy for them to fade into the background. And as soon as we start to learn more and notice them, I promise you'll start to see them everywhere. And if we want to be able to conserve soils so that they can continue to provide those important ecosystem functions, we have to be able to see them, study them, observe them. We have to be able to get to know them. And so what I want to tell you a bit about today are some of the approaches that soil scientists use to study and characterize soils in the field. And then from there, I'll tell you a bit more about how soils form, why there are so many different types of soils, and I'm going to think more about how this variation exists within California grasslands. And then from there, we'll think about how we might conserve those soils and some of the ongoing work that we're doing at Cal Poly in my research group and with collaborators around the state to be able to advocate for soil conservation in California grasslands. So why grasslands? Well, grassland soils are diverse, and as I'll show you in just a minute, but they provide these important ecological functions. Of course, here in California, many of our grasslands are the basis of our rangelands and our cattle industry. The grasslands are also places where we spend time in open space. Many of us, I would imagine, might have spent time looking for solace in some of our local grasslands. And they're also really important for regulating climate and some of those other things that I mentioned earlier. But grasslands around the state are threatened by lots of different challenges, including urbanization, agricultural development, climate change and drought in particular here around the state, erosion. And these challenges lead to the need for restoring some of those grasslands and the soils that support those grasslands. So there's a lot of interest in trying to understand how we can best restore, not just conserve, but also restore grasslands around the state. But in order to be able to do that well, to be able to restore grasslands around the state well, we first have to understand why grassland soils are so diverse in different parts of the state, even within just a single property. I'm going to come back to this photo here in a few slides, and I'll show you the many different soil types that we find just in this one ranch that's nearby Cal Poly, where I live and work. So grassland soils are very diverse. These four photos here are all from different soil profiles that are found in California's grasslands. And so you might notice that they look different. They've got different colors, shapes, the vegetation is a bit different. So the question that I want to try to answer here is, why is that? Why are grassland soils so diverse? What is the reasoning for all of these very different soil types? And soil scientists have devised an approach to do this, or a framework for thinking about why there are so many different kinds of soils and how we can understand that variation. And these are the soil forming factors. I love this illustration and artwork by Luis that shows that soils are a function of climate, organisms, relief or topography, parent material, and time. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a bit more detail. But the basic idea here is that all of these things, climate, the original source rock, the age of the soil, the organisms in the soil, these are all interacting together to create the unique soils that we see. So the reason that we have so many different soil types in grasslands or really anywhere is because there are unique combinations of these different soil forming factors. And soil scientists are interested in trying to parse out or evaluate each one of these different soil forming factors to try to understand, for example, how climate influences the features and properties of a given soil over time. So soil originally comes from rock. We think about soil as the product of the weathering of rocks and minerals. And because there are so many different types of rocks and different shapes of a landscape, which we call a landform, that gives rise to these unique soil types. So this is a block diagram here that shows the landscape here in San Luis Obispo County along the coast. You can see the Pacific Ocean on the bottom, and then it sort of goes up from there. And there are a bunch of different kinds of soils along this landscape. And the reason for that is because there are different kinds of original parent materials. So that's different types of rocks, for example, or different materials that have been moved and shaped across as they move across the landscape and deposited in different places. So a couple of common parent materials that give rise to different types of soils are residuum. This is essentially a soil that has weathered in place from the underlying bedrock. And when we think about soil as sort of growing and changing with time, that residual material or the rock from which that soil formed, it imparts the characteristic of that rock onto the soils that form from that rock. But other soils will form from the movement of material across a landscape. So alluvium is material that's been moved by flowing water and it's been transported from one place to another. And that process of movement leads to unique features within the soil. And when we go out and observe a soil, we can often tell whether it's been moved and shaped and manipulated by water. Colluvium, the last one on the list here, this is a material that has been moved by the aid of gravity. So you can think of it as rocks and sediment that is weathering and sort of tumbling down a hill and being deposited somewhere else. And that process of movement across the landscape, again, gives the soil a unique look. It gives it unique shapes and features that we can ascertain when we go out to study those soils in the field. So because we have so many different types of underlying material, parent rock, and the shape of the landscape varies from place to place, this gives rise to many different unique soil types. Once that parent material has been deposited somewhere or is weathering in place, then there are a suite of different processes that act on those diverse parent materials to create the soils that we actually see and study in the present day. And so we can think of those in four broad categories: additions, losses, translocations, and transformations. Additions are things that come into the soil, so precipitation, rain, snow, for example, or maybe there's some erosion happening at the top of the hill and that material gets deposited onto a soil lower down. Those are considered additions. Plants, of course, also make additions into the soil, so through their roots and decaying plant material, that eventually gets incorporated into the soil. So there's many different processes by which material gets into a soil and influences the way that it looks and behaves. Then there's the opposite process of losses. That you can have losses of soil through water that has moved down through the soil profile and picks up things along the way and eventually goes into the groundwater and moves away from that soil. You could also have erosion, for example, would be another example of a loss, depending on whether you're losing soil or adding soil in that process. And then there's the things that happen within the soil itself. Translocation is movement of material from one place to another. And transformations are chemical reactions like decomposition and weathering that reshape and reform the soil from one thing to another. So, as you can imagine, we have a layer of diversity of different parent materials, lots of different types of rocks. Then we have all of these different processes that are operating on those rocks, those weathered rocks and soil material. And so together, this already creates these really unique combinations of soil features that we can see out there in the world. And our job as soil scientists is to try to disentangle those a little bit. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is that not all soil processes operate in the same way. And so here you've got a figure, it's a conceptual figure with time on the x-axis and the soil property on the y-axis. So you can think of on the y-axis is if the value is higher, that means there is more of that thing. To give you a concrete example, that might be something like clay that weathers from a rock or a mineral. So over time, weathering occurs and we get more clay being produced into the soil. But there are some soil properties that will decrease over time. There are other soil properties that will sort of slowly increase and then level off over time. There are some soil processes that will occur at one period in the history of the soil that don't occur later on in the history of that soil. And so now if we start to bring all these things together, a bunch of different parent materials, lots of interacting complex soil processes, we can begin to see why there is so much variation in the different types of soils across a landscape. So one way that we think about this as scientists is we think about how soils develop both across space. So this soil here in San Luis Obispo is much different than a soil in Alaska, for example. But we also think about how soils change over time. And while soils are forming over thousands of years, it's difficult for us to be able to watch that in real time. we can use clues within the soil in present day to help us understand what might have happened in the history of that soil back in time. So it's a little bit like being a nature detective, where you only have clues for right now, but you're using those clues to help you interpret what might have happened in the past. And so I know there's a lot of text on this figure here, but I wanted you to be able to see how these blocks of soil, each of those rectangles represents a block of soil, can either increase in volume, so the soil can become bigger. That's considered soil formation. But also, soils can decrease in volume over time. And so, when we think about how soils have changed over their long history, there are some processes that lead to the formation of soil, and there are also some processes that lead to the degradation of soil. And particularly when we're thinking about how the way that we interact with soils as humans through agriculture or land management or even in urban settings, we have the ability to influence whether we are supporting soil forming processes or leading to soil losses and erosion and degradation. And so I actually think that taking this longer view of how soils form over space and time can teach us some good lessons about how we should interact with soils in the present day. Okay, we've covered a lot of reasons for why soils are so diverse. And in California grassland soils, we have so many different soil types. I'll tell you a bit more of that later on. But before we can actually identify the different types of soil, we need to be able to study those clues that I mentioned earlier. And soil scientists have devised different observations that we can make physically from a soil in the field to help us do that detective work of figuring out how that soil got there in the first place and understanding how it behaves and might change in the future. And so here are two pictures. These are actually both soils in Alaska, and they just show the what we call the soil profile. The soil profile is a cross-sectional view of the soil when you're looking at it straight on. So you dig a hole in the ground, or you find a place where the soil has been exposed, and you could start to see these layers within the soil. Sometimes those layers are very obvious. Sometimes they're mixed around and it takes a bit to discern where they might be. The reason that that soil there on the right looks so mixed up like that is because in Alaska, there's a lot of permafrost, really cold temperatures, and that leads to this freeze thaw activity that sort of mixes up the soil and makes it look really unique like that. That's a nice example of how the climate influences the properties of the soil that we can see. So when soil scientists like myself are trying to study and learn a new soil, the first thing that we will do is go out to a soil and make an observation of a soil profile. This is a soil forming along the Mississippi River in Wisconsin, and you can see these nice layers going down vertically from the surface all the way deeper past a meter in that photo there. And so this soil profile represents the basic unit of investigation. So like the starting point for soil scientists to come in and try to understand how that soil formed. But this diagram here shows how that profile, what we're looking at, represents a three-dimensional body. So soils are actually connected in space. It's kind of like a blanket across the landscape, where it's not like an individual plant where you can say, yes, this is the tree, and this is not the tree over here. With soils, they're much more continuous and connected over space. And so sometimes it's difficult to identify where one soil stops and another soil begins. It's more like a blanket or a fabric that creates the landscapes that we see. Soil scientists will describe the profile or cross-sectional view, but we use that as a way to understand this three-dimensional body of the soil, and we call that the pedon. And then multiple different pedons will link together across a larger landscape to shape the things that we observe. Like when you're going on a hike out in a grassland, you're not looking at one individual soil, you're looking and observing many different soils connected across that space. So when we come to a soil profile like this, we use tools and our observational skills to make some assessments about what are the main features of that soil. And I want to highlight just a couple of tools that we use and show you how those can be clues for figuring out how that soil came to be. The first and probably most striking one is the color of the soil. So, one of the first things that you might notice about a soil is the color. And the soil color can actually tell us quite a bit about what is in the soil here. And we will use these Munsell color books that allow us to match the color that we see in the soil with standardized color palettes that are designed for rocks and soils. And that's a way that we can sort of standardize our measurements. These are my hands here holding a handful of soil this is in Texas. And you'll notice that there's multiple different colors within the handful of soil there. And those multiple colors come from the water status of the soil. So when soils are really wet, they change color. And that has to do with the reduction of iron. So it's a chemical reaction that occurs within the soil that will change the color of the soil. So being able to make observations of the color of the soil can help us understand the types of processes that are occurring in that soil over a given time period. And before I started studying soil, I thought soils were brown out there growing plants. I didn't know anything about them. And it wasn't until I took a soil science class where I learned and came to appreciate how colorful and beautiful soils can actually be. This is just an example of the huge variety of different colors that we find in different soils from around the world. And I have come to appreciate soils as much as a piece of art as a object of study for science. I pulled a map of the US that shows just the color of the soil within the top 25 centimeters. And you can notice that even at this really large scale across the continent, there's quite a bit of variation in the color of the soil. And so that's one of the things that we want to use to figure out how that soil formed. If we zoom in a bit closer to California, you can see that that pattern holds. There's lots of shades of browns and oranges and reds and some darker and some lighter colors. There's quite a bit of variation across the state. And those colors come from common pigmenting agents in the soil. And there's basically two types of pigmenting agents. The first one is organic matter. That's material that comes from decomposing plants and roots. That organic material, that biological material that's decomposing, it gives the soil a color, and it tends to darken that soil over time. That's why in grassland soils, where grasses are adding that organic matter through their roots and through their above ground biomass year after year after year, that will lead to a darkening of the soil because that organic matter gives it that color. So when we measure or observe the color of the soil when we're out in the field, that can give us a clue to the amount of organic matter that might be in that soil. All of the other colors on these square color chips here come from the minerals of the soil. So like I mentioned earlier, soils are derived from the weathering of rocks, and rocks have different colors. You may have experienced different rocks in your life, or perhaps you have a rock collection, and you might have noticed that rocks come in all kinds of different colors. And when those rocks and minerals weather into soils, those colors become imparted on the soil. And so we can use the color of the soil as an indicator of the kinds of minerals that are there. And so it's a good clue for trying to understand the original parent rock or parent material that gave rise to that soil in the first place. Okay, that's color. Now, one of my favorites is the shape or structure of the soil. Another thing that we'll observe when we're in the field is how well do those soil particles hold together? And it turns out that there's lots of different configurations or shapes that soils can form into. And often it's sort of a blocky like structure, but sometimes when you have a lot of clay in the soil, it helps those particles stick together really well. And you might get something that's long and skinny. This is called prismatic structure, where it's taller than it is wide. That's pretty common feature in some of our grassland soils in California. If you've ever been on a hike in a grassland and you've noticed deep cracks during the summer months, so when it's dry, and you've noticed cracks on the trail, that happens because of the types of clay that are in that soil that will swell up during the winter and shrink down during the summer. And that kind of cracking process also helps create this type of shape of soil. And so, just by looking at the shape or structure of the soil, we can use that as a proxy for the types of processes that might be happening in that soil over a longer period of time. You will not find a sandy soil that has a really coherent structure like this. And so, we can use it as a clue to figure out what that soil is made of and also, importantly, how it behaves. Because the structure of the soil influences how water can get into that soil, how it might respond to differences in management. And so the structure is what we consider a dynamic property of soil. You can lose the structure of the soil over time if you till up and break the soil, or you can help form that structure if you're planting really deeply rooted, robust plants, for example. So when we're thinking about the shape and the structure of the soil, it tells us a lot about the way that that soil has been treated and the way that it forms over time. Another really important feature of the soil is the texture. And this is one of my favorites because it's very tactile. It's something that you can feel and experience when you spend time with soils. And the texture of the soil is as it sounds, it's what the soil feels like. But scientists define it more specifically as the relative proportion of sand, silt, and clay. Clay are these really small particles, they're tiny, whereas sand are much larger particles. And if you've been to a beach, you have experienced sand particles. So you can probably envision what that might look like, or the jars in this photo here have different sizes of sands. So those are larger particles. But clays are really tiny. So these black and white photos on the bottom here, those are some microscopic images of clay particles. They're very, very small and they form in these little sheets that can layer on top of each other. And the reason that that's important is because it influences the way that the soil behaves, how well it holds on to water, how well it holds on to nutrients, how susceptible it might be to erosion. And so knowing something about the texture of your soil can really tell you a lot about the way that it behaves. And I want to show you a little video here. This is how we can actually estimate the texture of the soil using just our fingers, our senses. This is called the ribbon technique. This is me just rubbing the soil between my fingers and I'm listening, I'm watching, I'm feeling, and you can get pretty good at this to actually estimate how much clay is in the soil just from using your senses alone. I love that kind of tactile nature, and teaching students how to do this in the field is one of my all-time favorite things. Okay, and then the last clue that I want to tell you about today are the rocks in the soil, so the fragments of rocks. This is a beautiful soil that I encountered on a long run in Colorado. And it stopped me in my tracks because I noticed these different layers, or we call them horizons, of different shaped and sized rock fragments. And so I mentioned earlier that some soils have been moved by flowing water. That's called alluvium. And when that happens, the water will shape and smooth out the rocks. So if you've ever walked along a riverbed, you might have noticed that those river rocks are really rounded and smooth. And so that's a clue that we can use in the soil. When we see those rounded rock fragments, it tells us, oh, this material was probably moved by flowing water at some point. And we can use that to help infer the overall context in which that soil formed. Rock fragments can also tell us a lot about the underlying type of parent material. So it's not just the shape of the rock, but also the composition or the type of rock that it is. So if you are observing a soil that's weathering from sandstone, for example, being able to identify the sandstone can help you understand the features of the soil, it being sandy, for example, that might arise when that sandstone breaks down into soil and sediment. So these are some of the features that we can describe out in the field when we're observing a soil profile. We look at the color, we look at the texture, we look at the structure or the shape of the soil, we look at the rock fragments, and we also make observations of where those different layers or horizons are and how all of those properties vary across those horizons. And the purpose of doing this is to get to know that soil, and eventually we want to be able to give the soil a name. In the same way that plants and animals have names, scientific names, soils also have scientific names. And so here in the US, we use the keys to soil taxonomy from the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service to help us identify or classify a soil. And these little icons here is a piece of artwork that I put together a couple of years ago that tries to simplify all of that complexity and show you the 12 different broad categories of soil that we find here in the US. And so once we can give a soil a name, then that gives it some weight and we can communicate between different scientific disciplines, and we know we're all talking about the same thing. These 12 different soil types are the broad categories of soils, but soil scientists actually classify soils into much, much smaller, more specific categories. And in the US, we have 25,000 some very specific soil types that you can find. And you can actually go online and look up the soil types in your area. I did a little search of where the Sonoma Land Trust offices are in Santa Rosa, and I pulled up the soil maps for that area. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the soils that I was looking at in that area. And so you can search for the Soil Web app online, or you can also go to this link here and explore more about the soils in your local area. And when you do that, you might find diagrams that look like this. And these are schematic diagrams of those soil profiles that I was showing you earlier. And here in that area in Santa Rosa, we had the YOLO series, which is this very deep, well-drained soil forming in a floodplain. So it's more of that material that's been moved by flowing water. And you can see how the color of the soil varies all the way from the surface down through the profile as well. And then right next door on a little bit older soils, we have soils that look a little bit different. They've got a more accumulation of clay and but still are forming in this older alluvial material. So I think it's really fun to be able to explore the soils in different places and use those resources of the soil maps to help us understand our local soils. It's the same way like you might want to learn about your local birds or the local plant life in the regions where you live and work. I think that getting to know our local soils is also really important. It's important for us to recognize that even soils that are really close together can be very different. So these soils that I just showed you on the previous slide, they're co-located. They're adjacent to each other. And so even in a really small area or a single ranch or a single park, for example, you can get soils that are very different. And that's often in large part because of the variation in topography. So a soil at the top of the hill can look quite different than the soil at the bottom of that very same hill. And so this is one thing that makes it challenging to restore soils in our grasslands because there's just so much variation, even in a pretty small place. So I want to give you an example of that. This is Choro Creek Ranch, which is one of the teaching and learning ranch facilities that we have here at Cal Poly. And here are two soils that are really close together, one at the top of the hill, one at the bottom of the hill. And you can see just immediately from the color of the soil how different those two soils are. These are like a 1 minute walk from each other. They're very close together, yet you can see that they're forming in different types of parent materials. We've got a sandstone for this reddish orange soil, and then alluvial and colluvial material for this darker soil at the bottom of the hill. And because they're in different locations on the hillside and they have different parent materials, you get totally different soil properties in a very close proximity to each other. And so, if we want to be able to conserve and restore these soils, we have to understand that variation over space, even within a relatively small area. I think this is one of the things that makes studying soils exciting. You dig a hole in a new place and you're always surprised by something unique. Every soil is different and has a story to tell. But practically, it also makes it challenging to incorporate that kinds of soil information into our restoration. And so, one of the things that we have been working on over the last several years is trying to integrate more of this soils information into those grassland restoration efforts that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And when we think about restoration, which is essentially just a targeted intervention that aims to improve an ecosystem or a landscape that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, if we want to intervene to improve those ecosystems, knowing something about the soils can be really helpful. And so, one way that these four boxes here represent different steps of the restoration process. First, we want to develop a reference model. We want to know what our grasslands or what we want our grasslands to look like, perhaps based on past conditions of how they used to look before whatever the degrading factor was changed the nature of those grasslands. Or perhaps we want to think about how those grasslands might look in the future with changing climate or increasing drought, for example. How can we conserve those grassland features in these future predictions that we have for a given area? And so understanding something about soils can help us figure out what our reference model should be. Then in restoration, the next step is to figure out what our baseline conditions are. So what are the properties of the soil right now? And we want to know that because if we intervene, let's say we plant some certain plants to try to do some restoration, or perhaps we change the grazing management of an area, we want to know what the properties of the soil were like beforehand so that we can evaluate whether or not our intervention worked and actually improved the properties and functions of that grassland over time. And so knowing something about soils can help us establish those baseline conditions and then evaluate which interventions might be useful for getting the outcomes of that reference model that we want. So getting us closer towards the restored grassland state that we're after. And then what we want to do is monitor those soil properties over time. So we know what the baseline is, we've done some kind of intervention, and then we want to be able to go back and make those same measurements and say, okay, has our intervention actually improved some of the soil properties that we're targeting? And while there's been lots of interest in restoration over the years, there are still many opportunities for greater integration of soils knowledge into restoration projects. And there have been calls in the scientific community for this several times over the last 20 years or so. And there's still a lot of interest in thinking about how we can take all of that complexity that I talked about earlier with the formation of different soil types and using that to make good decisions about how we should do restoration. And this figure here, I think it's helpful for illustrating that idea of the complexity. So on the x-axis, we have sort of progress from the degraded state towards the restored state of that ecosystem. And then on the y-axis, we have a measure of how useful it is to know something about soils. And it turns out that when you have an ecosystem that's more complex, knowing something about soils becomes even more useful and helpful as that complexity increases. So if you have a completely degraded state that is completely devoid of plants, then just trying to get some plants in the ground can help. Like, for example, after a mining operation. But once you're trying to restore the ecological functions in a more complex way, knowing something about your soils and how they interact with the plants at the surface becomes even more helpful for making restoration decisions. So, in order to address some of these knowledge gaps, we have been working together with several collaborators at different institutions across the state. Cal Poly Humboldt, Point Blue Conservation Service, CSU Chico, and here at Cal Poly as well, among many of our project partners. And we're working on studying soils in coastal grasslands around California to inform some of these restoration projects. So here you can see a highlight of a couple of different places where grasslands where we have worked along the state. And I want to spend the rest of the talk giving you just a couple of quick highlights and examples of ways that we're working towards filling some of those knowledge gaps in grassland restoration around the state. The first one is developing a reference model. So remember, that's kind of the first step of restoration. And one of the things that can be useful is knowing what soil types you have on the property that you're trying to restore. This is that photo that I brought up earlier. And so this is just one ranch here at Cal Poly. And you can see that all four of those different soil profiles underneath, they look very different. All four of them are present on that same one ranch. And so trying to understand that complexity to help you develop what your grassland could look like after restoration, I think can be really helpful. But there's a lot of terminology and jargon that is embedded within these taxonomic names of soils that are not always particularly intuitive. And so we are working on developing a simplified guide to help practitioners who are working on restoration projects use this information that comes from the soil maps to make decisions in their restoration. We went around all of the soil maps of the state of California and we looked at just the soils that are found in grasslands. And we found that there's over 700 different types of soils in California grasslands. And that's a whole bunch of diversity and complexity to try to unpack. And so I'm working with a group of students and some of our collaborators to help create some simplified guides that can help us target the things that are most important to consider when we're trying to restore these grasslands. The next phase of restoration is to establish baseline conditions. So we want to know what's there and then go back and monitor those properties again later on. And so we're using two key ecological features or soil properties that represent different ecological functions to help us understand that. And both of these properties are sensitive to changes in management or the way that we interact with our soils. So, for example, if we have some intervention like grazing or planting certain species, those things can influence these two properties of the soil. And so that's why we have highlighted them for this project. The first one comes back to our discussion of structure from earlier, where we thought of the shape of the soil, and that's aggregate stability. It's how well the soil sticks together, the structural integrity of those particles, which influences the amount of carbon that a soil can hold on to, how water moves down through the soil profile and is thus available to plants. Aggregate stability is really important measure. And then the other one is soil organic matter, which is, again, that material that is decaying from plants and animal and microbial residues. It's a very heterogeneous pool, and that organic matter is the basis of soil fertility. So we're working on trying to understand how we can use these to inform our grassland restoration efforts. This is a study that we worked on with several students that looked at how different methods of measuring aggregate stability could help inform decisions that you make in a restoration context. So we compared a lab-based method, which is that first panel. There's petri dishes of those little aggregates in there, versus a field-based method. So observations we can make from our eyeballs in the field. And we compared that across three different sites along that gradient of coastal grasslands in California. And we found that if you're comparing across three sites that are in totally different locations, the field-based method can help you discern differences between the sites. So our furthest south site, Rancho Marino, had the lowest aggregate stability, and it was different than the other two sites. But if you really want to know how aggregate stability is changing across one property, so in that close proximity of different soil types, using a more precise laboratory-based method is much more useful. But of course, that takes longer. It has additional costs. It requires a different technique. And so there are some trade-offs here. And we wrote a paper for the California Native Grasslands Association Grasslands Journal, where we sort of outline which approaches you might use depending on what your goals are for your restoration. We also looked at soil organic matter across these different sites, and we looked at two different types of organic matter in the soil. That particulate material, which is plant fragments, just broken down bits of plant. And then there's mineral associated organic matter, which has been highly microbially processed and decomposed. And it's basically the leftover biomass of those microorganisms after they have died and decayed. And so it's very microbially processed and has a different chemical signature than that particulate fragments of organic matter. And of course, we found that there's variation the deeper you go down into the soil profile. So the colors here represent the depth. And as you get deeper, you get less of that organic matter than you do at the surface, which makes sense because plants are at the surface. But we also found quite a bit of differences across the sites. And so trying to help practitioners measure soil organic matter at different depths can be really informative for thinking about interventions for restoration that go beyond just what's happening right at the soil surface, because we know that soils form much deeper than just the top 10 centimeters. Another thing we've been working on is evaluating different intervention options using some of these measurements of aggregate stability and the amount of organic matter that's in the soil. And so we've focused our research on different grazing techniques. So either rotational grazing of cattle. So rather than over one ranch property having cattle graze all of the time, there are management strategies where you can sort of rotate and move the cattle around in different locations so that there is a longer rest period for the grasses and forbs in a given area over the period of a year and eventually multiple years. And we've also looked at a study where we just removed grazing altogether and looked at what happened to plants, but I'm going to focus on those soil properties today. In that first study here, we compared three different ranches that had different grazing regimes or grazing strategies. One in brown here, Choro Creek Ranch. This was a site where there's continuous grazing all the time, and the grasses are only rest for a matter of weeks. Whereas the green bars in the center, that was a grazing management strategy where there was rotational grazing, and the grasses would be allowed to rest for a matter of months before the cattle came back to that same site. And then we compared that to an adjacent property. So all of these properties shared a fence line, which made for sort of an interesting study. An adjacent property where they had actually removed cattle altogether for 3 years, and there was no grazing there at all. And when we looked at these organic matter pools, so the particulate organic matter at the top and the mineral associated organic matter at the bottom, surprisingly, we actually didn't see a difference between any of these grazing regimes. And that could be because of the time period, though some of these grazing regimes had been operating for over 15 years. But it takes time for changes in the plant community to translate to changes in the soil. And so we didn't see a measurable difference in the amount of carbon and organic matter in the soil at that time scale. We did, however, look at the abundance of soil nematodes, which is part of that vast soil biodiversity that I mentioned earlier, at these same different sites. And we found that continuous grazing, so when you left the cattle there out all of the time, actually had the lowest nematode abundance. And these are soil organisms that are engaged in nutrient cycling and decomposition in the soil, which is beneficial to creating that organic matter that serves as the basis of soil fertility. And so while we didn't see those grazing regimes translate to changes in the organic matter itself, we did see some early signatures from the organisms living in that soil that there might be differences across these sites. And then the last study that I want to tell you about is a grazing removal study at a different property out at Rancho Marino in Cambria. This is on a beautiful marine terrace right along the coast. And at the time that we did this study, it had been 18 years that they had put up some fences and just fenced in some areas of the ranch that were no longer had access, the cattle no longer had access to those fenced in areas. And we looked at how that influenced the plants at the surface and also the soils down below. And while similarly to our other study, we did see an increase in the amount of biomass, so the amount of soil or of plant material at the surface in those ungrazed areas that hadn't had cows for almost 2 decades, that didn't actually translate into the amount of organic matter in the soil underneath. So in either of those particulate fragments or in that mineral associated pool. And I find this to be really interesting because it underscores that soils are dynamic over time, but slower to change than the plant community. And if we think back to those factors of soil formation, time is a really important piece of that puzzle. Soils form over thousands of years. And so, even though our management has the potential to change some of those properties of soils in the surface, it takes time for some of those things to develop. And that also means that if we do some kind of restoration intervention, we want to be sure to monitor how those soil properties are changing over a long period of time so that we make sure that we can capture those changes that might happen on terms of decades rather than single years. So one last tool I want to highlight from some of our partners at Point Blue Conservation Science is building user-friendly online tools that can help practitioners make decisions about which grassland species they might want to plant based on the properties and functions of those plants. And so this is just an example here of the tool that we're working on developing that allows you to choose the kinds of characteristics like drought tolerance, for example, or a pollinator habitat or something like that. You can select those characteristics and ecosystem functions that you're trying to support within a grassland, and it will give you a suite of different types of plants that you can select from. And we're working on incorporating some soils data into that as well to think about which plants grow well where and might be able to support some of these different ecosystem services. So this is just a really quick introduction to some of the various projects that we've been doing to try to help incorporate more soils knowledge into the many grassland restoration efforts that are happening across the state. There are so many opportunities to learn from the soils if we take the time to study them. So I want to leave you with two take-home messages here. One is that I hope I've convinced you that soils are dynamic, natural wonders that have so much to teach us about nature and our place in it if we give them the time to really study them. And then also that soils knowledge can help us better restore grasslands. And there's lots of different tools that we can use to everything from developing a reference model and figuring out what kind of restoration we want to do, to establishing baseline conditions and monitoring those soil properties over time. And just like anything, good things take time to develop. This is something that we're continuing to work on, these projects, but also thinking about how we can be good stewards to soils in our grasslands around the state takes time to get to know those soils in the first place and really value the many important things that soils do to support our grassland ecosystems. This little piece of artwork here sort of shows the development of a soil profile over time, where there's more horizons later on in the stage of development. And I think so much about how soils have taught me this idea of patience and that things take time, and the best things in life are certainly worth waiting for. So, with that, I want to thank you so much for the invitation to share my love of soils and California grasslands with you. I welcome questions, and you're welcome to contact me, visit my website, check me out on Instagram. And I do want to give a big shout out to the organizations that helped fund this work: Cal Poly, the CSU Agricultural Research Institute, and the University of California Office of the President, and our many important partners at Point Blue Conservation Science, Pepperwood Preserve, and Rancho Marino, among others, for allowing us to do some of this important work and explore the beauty and wonder of soils in California's grasslands. Thank you so much.